Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of the 286 Project with me, Chris Akers. On this podcast, we talk about arts, culture, politics, and sport, and anything else we can think of. Now, today's guest, we actually met in the last year at the Battle of Ideas at Buxton. He's a writer and freelance writer and journalist. It's Ella Whelan. Hello, Ella.
Hi, Chris. How's it going?
Okay. I'm very well. I'm very well, thank you. Now, the reason I invited yourself onto this to be interviewed is because of, well, two articles really. The first one was an article you contributed to, which was in a Daily Mail about maternity care in NHS, and you talked about your own experiences, and then you decided to do an investigation about it later on.
Mhm.
So let's talk about the Daily Mail article first. Can you just explain your own experiences with like maternity care in NHS and
Mm.
why that led you to investigate it later on?
Also, I had been for a number of years involved in groups of women who were doing some sort of research into the changing nature of maternity care. And the changing nature of parenting and motherhood and um, all these things that anyone who might not have kids or is young might think, well, is that even a thing? It's just something that happens to you. You become a mum, you become a dad, you raise kids, you do it. But in actual fact, there's a sort of whole ideology behind it that has grown up. A sort of parenting and even giving birth is now seen as a sort of skill you have to learn. So many sort of you're encouraged to go to all these classes to learn how to breathe through birth and all this. So it's this. I sort of knew that it was this sort of almost overcomplicated thing, and I knew that it was this thing that was quite heavily politicized. And as when I got pregnant, all the sort of midwife appointments that I was going to were full of sort of very sort of flowery language about how the birth of my child was going to be, reflect my identity, and that this was about me as a woman doing something. And did I have my favorite playlist? And did I? It was this kind of bespoke, custom made thing that was going to happen to me, this incredible moment, and blah 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 blah. And and then it happened, and it was awful, and it was you know things went wrong, and like does every day with women giving birth. Had to have an emergency C-section. The staff at the hospital I was at were pretty mean, and the level of care was very low. Things were sort of almost at bedlam sort of scenarios at certain points, with women in beds next to me, surrounded by cardboard bowls full of their own sick and no one looking after them. And it was just this rough, very rough experience. And it made me suddenly, I thought, right, there's something going on here, which is that we know that maternity care is very poor. We know that all these scandals have been happening, which is not just that women have had rough experiences, but that women have died and babies have died, horrendous numbers. And there have been all these reports. And so suddenly I thought, and lots of women like me have been thinking, well, hang on a minute, this doesn't match up. You're sort of sold a wonderful, almost spa-like experience with sort of aromatherapy and people rubbing your back and all these nice things, and it's all sort of it's all a bit of a lie, because everyone actually knows, and all those midwives actually know, that with the state of maternity care and the things that can go wrong in birth, none of that's probably going to happen. So I thought there's something to be said here about women being hoodwinked, and also women being pressurized, and women being failed. So that's why, I think, prompted by the fact there has been a lot of news about the maternity scandals, the deaths of women and babies, that the Mail wanted to get some kind of true stories about what had happened. So I told them mine.
So from there, you obviously investigated it further. Um, I imagine from when we were speaking before, when we met up, you said that a lot of women came to you, you just said there, and actually talked about their experiences.
Mm.
Were you surprised about the number of women that came to you? Because it seems to be almost a norm, what you're describing.
Yeah, it did surprise me. But the thing that also surprised me was that women don't talk about it. Which I understand because when you have a kid, and if your kid comes out, no matter what happens through the sort of gory horrendousness that can happen in birth, most people, when they get a healthy baby in their arms, they think, right, okay, nothing else matters, stitch me up and I'll deal with all of that some other time. you know
Yeah.
in a kind of dark night of the soul months later. Right now I've got to keep this little person alive. So I understand why people push it aside and see it as sort of the norm. I mean, it's like even I thought, well, I don't really want to whinge too much about this because, birth is difficult and all the rest of it. But it was the sort of the content of what women were telling me repeatedly. So, for example, in my case, I had two members of staff, my anaesthetist and the midwife, arguing over whether or not I was going to get pain relief. And this was after a C-section and quite a serious hemorrhage. So I most definitely needed a lot of morphine. And the medical staff were rowing at the bottom of my bed, um, you know, over whether or not I was going to be kept pain free. And, that's a serious miscarriage of care. I mean, that's something that really shouldn't happen. And that happened, repeatedly. I was told by women that they were handed a couple of paracetamol a few hours after a C-section, which is just completely inadequate, and cruel, very, very cruel. I was told repeatedly by women who were saying that um, they had had their concerns ignored. So, for example, a lot of the reasons why so many babies died in some of the maternity scandals was because women were saying things like, I can't feel kicking, I can feel that something's wrong. And in that late stage of pregnancy, you're very aware of what's going on. Everything, feels very close to the surface because you're such a huge size. And medical staff were ignoring them. And tragically, that's why a lot of babies were oxygen starved and either brain damaged or died. And that was happening as well. Women saying, "Well, I did say that I was feeling this way, or that the heart monitor had dipped, or blah blah blah," and they were being ignored, and having to sort of get their partners or husbands to be really pushy and demand what should be just a basic standard level of care. Um, and I think probably the most common thing was that, which is the sort of trickiest thing to talk about, is that we all want to, well, certainly I want to be a defender of the NHS. I think it's in the abstract, something that I want in society, which is a healthcare service free at the point of access for everyone. I don't want things to become like America. I probably don't even really want things to become like some places in Europe where you have to pay for a lot of it. I like the idea that you, in the abstract, should be able to go to hospital and get looked after. So we don't like to criticise the NHS, and we certainly don't like to criticise the people who work in the NHS because, they work very hard. They've got very difficult jobs, far difficult than anything I do. But
Yeah.
woman after woman after woman, and myself, had to admit that we weren't treated even nicely. We weren't treated well, but even there was no kindness in a situation in which you're at an extremely vulnerable moment as a woman who's just given birth. Your emotions are absolutely all over the place. You know that you're meant to be. You've got to kick into mum gear, but also you're sort of, it's just masses of stuff happening all at once. And I was treated very badly. Things like when my catheter came out because it hadn't been emptied, which is, after surgery, is a standard thing that should be done. And urine went all over the sheets, and I was sort of scolded as if I was a schoolgirl who wet the bed rather than a 31-year-old who'd just given birth. So I think that was the thing that a lot of people sort of whispered to me, which was, actually, my midwife wasn't that nice. And I think that's something that actually we do have to unpick, because I don't want to demonize midwives. I think they do a great job, but there's something going on here that needs to be addressed, I think.
Did you, in the course of your investigation, look at the training these midwives and other people involved with that get? Because again, from what you're saying, you'd think that first of all, someone who wants to be Mars would be naturally caring to go into the profession. But then, even if you're not as caring as people may think, you may going into training, you maybe say, okay, this is how you're supposed to treat a person who's in labour, etc., etc. But it seems like that's not the case.
I think there was two things going on that I found out through talking to some of the women doing a lot of work in this in the article. I mean, the first is a sort of no-brainer, which is that NHS staff are pushed to the limit.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they're tired, they're burnt out. We get that, and yes, that means that you're probably going to be not so good at being, so caring, particularly if you've done it for a number of years and this is your, you're on the night shift and, you get it. Yeah, I get it. It's just not fair when you're the patient, when I'm sat at home here now, I can say, oh, I feel really bad for those women, blah, blah, blah. But when I was in that bed, I was thinking, I'm going to kill one of you unless someone comes and changes my sheets, so I get the burnout argument. That's something that, better funding, better organisation of the NHS, more staff, no brainer. Let's do that. But the interesting thing that came out in the Unheard article was this slightly more complicated situation, which was in relation to the training, which is that women like who I spoke to, like Ruth Edwards and Sue and Catherine, um, all had looked into how a focus on natural outcomes and birth, so natural vaginal births rather than C-sections, um, and a focus on natural processes like breastfeeding rather than formula feeding, giving babies a bottle,
Mm-hmm.
um, had really come into play in terms of the way in which midwives were taught to think about and encouraged to think about what a good birth was. So the whole this idea grew within the NHS, a sort of, you know, kind of horrible marriage of a need to cut costs, because obviously if you're going to put someone under anaesthetic, that's going to cost a hospital, and so a need to cut costs, and this sort of kind of slightly sort of feministy, hippie kind of from external organizations like the NCT and birthright sort of idea that birth was this thing that was sort of not just a means to an end, not just
Mm-hmm.
like you give birth to have the baby, but that
Yeah.
birth in and of itself was this moment in a woman's life that was very important to sort of nurture in a sort of natural, holistic way.
Mm-hmm.
And those two things came together, and you ended up having targets for natural births in hospitals. And, if you're telling midwives that it is better overall to have in a week as many natural births as you can and as least C-sections or interventions as you can, and if you're also saying that it's much, much better if you push women to breastfeed rather than giving them the option of breastfeeding or bottle feeding. I mean, the option is there, but you have to fight for it. You know, that is that's a good birth. That's a good thing for a child and for the mother. Then obviously these midwives are going to feel pressure to go down a certain route. And the problem is that route, one, has led to an oversight in care with people dying, women and babies dying. But two, it's, I mean, that's the, it's not, healthcare isn't a political act. Giving birth isn't some kind of, it's not a statement of identity. It's not a political act. It's just a thing I have to do to get this baby out of me. Like,
Yeah.
and I, you know, each to their own. Women who want to think of it as something, far more momentous and bigger, of course, that's up, whatever. I don't care. Do think and feel about it however you want. But NHS policy and NHS training and the overall view of how women's healthcare should be arranged should not be politicised and should not be subject to the whim of, the influence of external organisations who have no scientific or medical training or background. So I think that, the really interesting thing came out of how midwifery is changing and how it's being influenced by external conversations about women and their feelings and their identity, and the trends that we all are subject to in, a push towards more natural stuff. Everyone now, particularly in healthcare, talks about how, you don't really need medicine, all you need to do is eat better, and you're like, okay. I mean, that kind of that mindset has an influence across the board.
isn't one of the other problems as well that despite the train almost train too much, and what I mean by that is when it comes to certain emergencies in that situation, instead of just taking charge, too often they're asking the mother, "Oh, can we do this and can we do that?" When really it just needed to get done.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a real well, there's been a debate about whether or not the sort of move to turn midwifery and nursing into sort of degrees and to almost I'm making up a word now, academize, turn it into a sort of
Mhm.
academic um process rather than a you know a I don't know what the word is, sort of like a vocation, a skill, a job that you learn on the job, and it's about doing rather than sort of studying. And that's not to say that it's not just studying is unnecessary in any of these situations, but I think there's been a sort of desire to um turn everything into, yeah, a tick box exercise. And one of the things that it's a bit slightly before getting pregnant, because we had to go through several rounds of IVF to have our son. And a really interesting and kind of horrible thing that I discovered in the NHS is that there is just such a lack of authority and confidence within doctors and nurses and training staff and medical staff. Um, and one of the examples in which this happened was after you've gone through the process of IVF, if it's successful, you hopefully end up with some embryos at the end of it, which then have to be implanted into your womb. And I was asked whether or not I wanted two embryos put in or one. And yeah, that's quite a big decision to make, because the more embryos you put in, the more likely you're going to have a kid at the end of it, but also the more likely there are complications and miscarriages. So it's not a it's a pretty key question in the whole scheme of trying to have a child through IVF, and something that you would imagine would take a very sharp medical mind to be able to
Yeah.
make that decision and say, in your scenario with your history, blah blah blah, we think this is the right course of action. um and so when I said, well, I don't want to make that decision, I have no idea, you may as well ask me to flip a coin, I've got no idea. I was told that I had to make that decision, and that legally, that the NHS doctors could not make that decision for me. And that was just a very cruel amount of pressure to put on somebody who very desperately wanted a child and was very, very worried about screwing it up. And, I just had to basically had to flip a coin. And it turned out it didn't work anyway, but at that time, but, that sort of explicit lack of authority when where in years gone by, a doctor would have said, your opinion, don't want to hear it, which had its cons. I'm not saying a sort of level of arrogance is what we need, but some sort of sense of, we do know what's best. We are the medically trained people here. We are going to take charge. I think that's been lost in the whole process. And certainly in relation to maternity care, you are constantly being asked what you think, how you feel, which is very, I suppose a little bit of that would be nice, but you end up feeling, do you really know what you're doing here? Because please stop asking me, because my job is not to know how to deliver this baby safely. That's your job. So I think there's a real crisis of authority and confidence within the NHS, within medical staff themselves, and that's a real problem.
Yeah, especially if you're a first time mother where you've not been through that process before. If you're your second or third or fourth child, etc., you can at least you can feel, that process, you can feel the changes. But especially as first time mother, I mean, to be asked about that about IVF, it's a very emotive question. It's a very loaded question when you're very emotive, even
Mm.
just sitting there. But I don't understand why they would do that. It just seems to be like a compensation culture that makes common sense fall out the window.
Yeah, I think that is a very important problem, which is that we are becoming a little bit like America,
Mm.
where there's, people feel that the only way to deal with things like this is to become very litigious and sue doctors. And, if you're a, if you're, for example, one of these women whose babies did die through medical negligence, I don't think there's anything wrong with them wanting to seek compensation and who would I be or you be to judge those people in that scenario? I mean, I can't imagine being in that position, and I wouldn't want to judge someone for trying to get some kind of compensation for what they've lost. But on the other hand, I mean, it does create a situation in which I think a lot of NHS trusts and hospitals feel incredibly nervous. It's not, it's, it's a trend that's been happening elsewhere. I kind of think back to, for example, the row over Alfie's Army, which was a sort of an instance where a child was being given care at, I think it was Great Ormond Street Hospital, and eventually, tragically, doctors decided that this care was going nowhere, that the child was not able to be, was surviving off of being on machines, and they thought it was best to take him off the machine, and the outcome would be that eventually he would have died. But there was no way that his life was going to progress. The doctors made that decision, and the parents disagreed, and this horrible, horrible, toxic row developed between the parents and the hospital, and it turned into, rather than just being a sort of, I suppose, tension which most people could understand, which is parents would never give up and doctors at some point have to make a call. It turned into this huge thing of Alfie's Army, and it was a real expression of people's mistrust in the medical system and in
Yeah.
doctors, and actually, that it sort of became symptomatic of this quite big issue, which is, I think, a lot of us know that whether it's when we go to the GP or when we go to see someone in the hospital, when we go to A&E, you've got this armor on. You sort of you're ready for a fight. You know that you've got to be pushy. You know that you've got to maybe lie a little bit to get in the queue. You
Yeah.
know that there's no real sort of, there's no real strong trust there, and that kind of breakdown in trust, I think, has had a very, as much of an effect on this problem as the sort of litigious culture, which is that doctors feel that they don't have, and nurses feel that they don't have the same kind of authority, and patients don't feel like they have the same kind of authority. Um, but the interesting thing is that we've never had doctors and nurses involved in our lives so much than ever before. I mean, doctors and nurses now demand to know, you know, whether you're smoking, whether you're exercising, what kind of fruit and veg you're eating, blah blah blah. We have medical intervention into our lives through public health measures or whatever else constantly, and yet our relationship with uh, the NHS and medicine is often quite sort of um, tense and sort of dysfunctional.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. You've mentioned the mortality rate quite a lot with births. Statistically, what is our mortality rate at the moment, and has that increased or decreased? And what was the point in it where it was getting dangerously high or low?
But obviously, in terms of a general trend, um, women are, it's, we have the technology to be able to intervene and save babies' lives who would otherwise have died without medical intervention. So, in terms of now versus 40, 50 years ago, we're in a much better place. We have, things things that previously would have meant that a child would have died in the birth canal or in whatever. We now have the technology and actually access to hospitals and resources, which means that women don't have to go through that kind of thing. You can, for example, be like, do what I did, which is, because I'd had an IVF pregnancy and it was my fourth try, and there's an increased risk of stillbirth for IVF pregnancies. I just said, right, none of this pushing nonsense, none of this like birth center nonsense. Out through the sunroof, I'm in and out, and you're going to do this
Yeah,
very surgically and very safely. So you can do that. You can have actually technically a very easy birthing experience where the baby has no trauma at all, no danger, it's just lifted out into the world. Um, but the problem is that these measures and these resources aren't being used properly. So it's sort of not that technically we've gotten to a worse place. It's actually sort of more depressing. It's that we could be absolutely fantastic with very little fatality at all, but there is this inability and unwillingness to, well, there's a turn away from technology. There is literally a turning away from medical intervention. One of the texts that was on a reading list at a one midwifery course in the NHS, that one of these amazing women that I follow on Twitter, who sort of do the hard work of going into reading all the stuff, back documents in the NHS and reading this and things like that, found this book which sort of talked about the need for midwives to hold off when a baby is born and doesn't cry. If a baby doesn't cry when they're born, the assumption is that they're not getting oxygen and they're not, something's going wrong with breathing. And this book suggested that midwives don't rush in to intervene if a child is silent upon birth, because, and this is a quote, because they might be waiting for the spirit to come in. Now, obviously, that sounds hilarious. What that actually means is that there is a text on an NHS training course that is suggesting that nurses and midwives don't do their job and wait for, I don't know, divine intervention. That's scary. I mean, it's just one book on one course, and I'm not sitting here. I'm from the Academy of Ideas, which is for open debate. I'm not sitting here and saying things should be banned, or that you shouldn't read around, or you shouldn't have an interest in things. But I mean, Christ, if you're being
Yeah.
trained in how to be a medical professional, and you are not doing your job by trying to help an infant breathe, I don't know what to tell you. So I think the mortality rate, um, you know, things like, if people want to look up, viewers of this podcast, listeners want to look up things like the Donna Ockenden report, which was the breaking report from a midwife, Donna Ockenden, who was appointed to look into mortality rates at the Shrewsbury and Telford NHS Trust. Found that these sort of like hundreds of cases over a period of sort of 2 decades of women being mistreated, women dying, babies dying, things like that, have been going on for years. But it's just in the last sort of 2 years that they've sort of come to light with all these scandals and reports.
Waiting for the spirit to come in. That just sounds something that you would find in a Victorian book,
Mm.
something mad. Who actually writes the guidelines? Because that's just crazy. And who actually looks at them before actually publishing them and giving them medical advice?
Well, it's the interesting thing is that a lot of the sort of resources within the NHS, particularly in relation to maternity care and babies and parenting, are from external organisations. So, everybody, anybody who's watching and listening to this who has kids will have heard of the NCT, the National Childbirth Trust, where you sort of like a lot of people go to NCT classes to essentially learn how to become a parent. It's sort of been going for a very long time. Lots of people do it. I didn't do it because it's exorbitantly expensive, and I knew that I wasn't going to get anything out of it. But that organization has a huge influence on a lot of the sort of um, documents, policy making, thinking behind maternity care. If you take something like breastfeeding, for example, which has become, you know, it's almost all that your midwife talks to you about in the run up to giving birth. I mean, really, it is pretty much 80% of every appointment was, have you thought about breastfeeding? Blah 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 blah. So it's a real obsession of the NHS. Um, and in terms of cold, hard medical and scientific research around whether or not breast is best for babies, it's there's very little, and it's very hard to say, because it's very hard to take the same child, or you can't take the same child or even twins and give one breast milk and one formula milk and make them live the exact same life and see, if it's um with no sort of compounding factors, and see what happens. So it's we know that in the first sort of day or two, breastfeeding is pretty good because you get antibodies, you get, all kinds of stuff, whatever. But that, after that, it's kind of much of a muchness. And, there's a generation like mine who grew up on bottles, who are absolutely fine. My son never got a look in because I couldn't breastfeed. He was brought up on formula milk, absolutely fine. And yet you are hounded, hounded to breastfeed. In my case, was told to try to get my son to latch 30 seconds after I've woken up from a general anesthetic and having hemorrhage. And I was green as a sort of ghoul. And, I was thinking that I was going to projectile vomit whilst I had this nurse trying to put my son on my breast. I mean, it was just ludicrous. And that's all, it's not sort of it's not what you imagine NHS policy would be based on, which is sort of peer reviewed, proper, scientific, we've done the tests in the lab kind of research. It's not. It's the influence of things like La Leche League, the NCT, external organizations who, for whatever reason, are obsessed with women breastfeeding, whether it's for political reasons or identity politics reasons, feminist reasons, and want to make every woman breastfeed. So there's a lot of mumbo jumbo that goes into NHS policy making. And I kind of feel like it's my mission, and all these women on Twitter who are writing about this feel like it's our mission to say, you do know you don't have to believe this because this isn't scientific fact.
That story just said there about the nurse coming in with a baby and wanting to latch on your breast. What is again? It just seems a lack of common sense. Did know someone must have said, "Hang on a minute, she doesn't look great. She's been through a traumatic experience. Surely there's a better way of doing this." Sure, but it just seems a total like, seems almost seems too regimented. Like, okay,
Mm.
she's had the birth now, so we must do this and then we must do that. It seems that there's no actual anyone standing up and saying, "Hang on a minute, let's sort this out properly." It's almost like I said, a tick box exercise. We've done this
Mm.
task, done this task. It just seems crazy to me.
It is like following a tick box. I mean, a really fascinating obsession that's happened within NHS maternity care recently has been this thing called skin to skin. And you might think, skin to skin, what's that? And when I was first asked by a midwife in maybe, I don't know, month 4 or 5 of my pregnancy, and she said, "Are you going to do skin to skin?" And I said, "Well, what's that?" And she said, "Well, it's a bonding exercise in which we put the baby's skin on your skin so that you can bond after birth." And I was like, "Do you mean, am I going to hold my baby?" You know, because I guess I probably will. You know, I was like, do you think, do I need to be naked to hold my baby? I mean, what is this going on? And it turns out that it is literally this sort of uh, quasi quack scientific theory that it is, so going back to some kind of view of us as just sort of like animals, that unless you literally have your skin, bare skin, on your baby's skin after birth, that the bonding experience isn't as good. And so you have this ludicrous scenario in hospitals where you have these it actually makes me laugh because it's so terrible. These poor dads being told to strip off, so the dads are made to get their tops off, and they lay the babies, naked babies, with covered in all the sort of like gunk that comes with birth, um, on their chest, and then they give them a kind of modesty apron. So you've got these dads lying bewildered, looking at their new child with this little sort of lump on their chest, naked, covered in sort of stuff, and a modesty apron. And it's just nonsense. It's just, the idea that you're not going to love your child if you don't get naked with them on the hospital ward, um, is ridiculous. And that's why because I sort of said, in the end, you don't want to be a bad mum, you don't want to be a bad dad. So you say, "Oh, well, okay, I'll do it. I suppose, yeah, okay, tick the box." Literally, in my birth plan, it had ticked, "Will do skin to skin," tick. Um, and it's terrible. And it meant that when someone should have been saying, "This poor woman does not look well, give her a minute," instead, my gown was pulled to the side and my son was plopped on my chest. And and this is the kind of serious bit, I, wear glasses, so I couldn't see, got quite bad eyesight. I felt very, 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 very sick. And I was coming, there was coming to from anesthetic, like from general anesthetic. I've been knocked out. I was very teary and very, apparently it's something to do with redheads. I don't know whether that's scientifically true or not, but I react very badly to anesthetic. I need, 15 minutes to sort of come around and feel normal again. I'd also hemorrhaged, like I said, so I had lost a lot of blood. So I was, it was like I was coming off of some very heavy drugs, and I ended up pushing my son off and away from me. Sort of my husband had to sort of kind of intervene and come and catch him. And I said things like, I don't think I love him. I don't want him. Take him away. And, was crying because this moment that had been sold to me as the moment you meet your child, the moment you do skin to skin, the bonding experience will be wonderful.
Oh
And of
God.
course it wasn't. It was never going to be, because that's not how bodies work, I'd been through something quite big, and I needed someone to just give me a minute. And if they had just given me a minute and I could have said, I'm ready to meet my son, sorry, it's making me a bit emotional. And then, I think it would have been very different for me in the first few weeks. But on top of everything else, and this is a story that women told me again and again and again, on top of everything else, I had to try and deal with the fact that I felt very guilty about basically rejecting my son in his first few seconds of life, which now I know is ridiculous,
Yeah.
didn't matter. I can think rationally now, but I couldn't think rationally for those first few weeks. And I came very, very close to being very seriously depressed at one point, and it was frightening. And there's just all of that could have been mitigated by a common sense, kind midwife saying, right, Dad, you go and hold Morris over there and have a nice stare into his eyes. We're going to get Mum a cup of tea with 4 sugars in it and a biscuit,
Yeah.
but because of a kind of tick box attitude, and because of a sort of like everything must be done by what we say in the birth plan and what's right, um, that doesn't happen. And I think that's a very sad thing. And just to say, it used to be, if you think about my grandmother's time, my nan had 5 kids. You'd go into hospital, you'd have the baby would be taken away and put in its little, wrapped up lovely by a nurse, taken care of, given a bottle, put into his or her cot and wheeled into the little sort of nursery, and Mum would be let sleep. And
Mhm.
actually Mum would stay in hospital for 3 or 4 days and be looked after. Her and baby would be looked after, because there was this understanding that, once you go back out home, you probably have 3 or 4 kids already. But women were really looked after. And I was bounced at 11 o'clock the next day, so I mean, things have really, really changed, and not for the better.
In your investigation, obviously you talked about this mismanagement of going through labour in hospitals. Has there been a difference between what happens in hospitals and women who have home births? Was it the
Well,
same?
there's a big interest in home births, but the levels usually are that women are more likely to go in and have them in a birth center or on a ward, or in emergency departments, because a, a lot of the time, if not most of the time, something happens that needs some kind of medical intervention. Um, I mean, you know, there are women that I know who have had completely unintervention, no one intervening home births. There's women I know who have given birth themselves in bathtubs and things like that, and more power to them. That's fine. Um, the idea of having to clean up a birthing pool in my sitting room after having a newborn is something that never appealed to me. I thought, oh, I don't want any of that stuff anywhere near my nice sofa. But the interesting thing about the sort of home birth levels is that there is um, there is a kind of increased push to do it, and I think partly it is a cynical thing, which is that one less woman in a bed on a ward, and there's a kind of cost cost benefit analysis going on. But also it's part of this sort of birth becoming an event thing that has grown. I mean, one of my close friends who has, with her first child, preeclampsia, and had ended up in quite an emergency situation, quite dangerous for her son. Something that you definitely wouldn't want to repeat. And if you had that once, you are at risk of preeclampsia in any future pregnancy. Is pregnant with her second child, and had the nurse say to her, "Well, have you thought about a home birth?" And she had to say no, because I'm not allowed one, because I have to be looked after quite closely, because I've got this high risk possibility. So I think it's sort of, again, it's this sort of mix of cynical reasons for finances and resources, mixed in with this sort of like kind of growth of birth should be this moment, this sort of what am I what how can I best describe it, that it becomes an end in and of itself rather than a means to an end. So it's no longer just the thing you do to have a child. It's this thing that you do to experience it in and of itself. And I can't get my head around that. I don't see how that works. And I also think it's kind of bullshit, because the number of women who I know who've really enjoyed their births, if they're really honest about it, probably can count on one hand in comparison to sort of like the horror stories we share at stay-in plays and soft plays, where people say, yeah, I thought I was gonna like breathe my way through it, and in the end we nearly ended up divorcing because I call my husband all these names under the sun. So
Indeed. Finally, and I know this is going to be admittedly a loaded question because but basically, what would you like to see done in terms of improvements in maternity care in the NHS for women?
I think it goes without saying that there needs to be more staff, and there needs to be more uh funding, in the same way that there does in the whole of the NHS, but in the right places, not just throwing money at it. Um, you know, I do think that if there was more resources, you could have women in a hospital for longer, and they could be given proper care rather than just the rush that it is at the moment. The people working on at the time that I was giving birth shouldn't have been there. There should have been people who were really good at their job and really wanted to be there. So that's the sort of, it's almost like the easy answer is resources and funding and staffing. Having midwives who uh you see consistently throughout your pregnancy. I didn't see the same midwife twice, which in some ways didn't really matter, but in other ways, things get missed, notes get missed, and blood tests get missed, and that's how accidents happen. So that's a kind of easy answer. I think the difficult challenge is, I think that the culture in the NHS has to change, which is that you've got this lack of uh, sense of authority and sense of pride in medical excellence, and there is too much influence from external organizations, external political pressures. I mean, we see this elsewhere in the NHS in relation to you know gender ideology and environmentalism and things like that coming into play, of how hospitals are run or how patients are treated and things like that. So I think you know the culture in the NHS has to change, in that there has to be a asserting of the fact that the only thing that matters in patient, or the most important thing that matters in patient care, is whether the patient is being medically looked after as well as they can, and that the technologies are being used properly, and that you leave the sort of political opinions, the external influences, and the mumbo jumbo at the door. And I think also there has to be a sort of reckoning in maternity care, that however much the NHS might think that natural births are a good thing, and might think that women should breastfeed more, they need to start listening to women who are saying, I don't care what you think, this is what I need.
Yeah.
I need support for formula feeding. I need a C-section right now. I need, you to listen to me when I'm telling you that my baby's not kicking. So there isn't a easy answer to this. There seems to be so much going wrong. But I think that it's maternity care that's the problem, and not, there are lots of problems in the NHS: cancer waiting lists, nobody can get a hip operation, nobody can see a GP. We know that there are big problems in this organisation, but I think the maternity scandal has proven that there has been such a level of medical negligence in relation to the thing that the future of society depends on, which is women giving birth, um, that we need to really take a forensic view and think about what is exactly going wrong here.
I know this has been personal for you, and obviously where you come across is very passionate. So I really appreciate you being on the podcast. I'll leave a link to the article you did with Unheard in the description. Ella Whelan, thank you so much for talking about it.
Well, thank you very much, Chris. It's a great pleasure to be able to go into such depth about it, and I hope everyone who's listening and watching does some more reading themselves, because there's some really interesting stuff out there about this.
Oh, cool. Thank you very much.